Hello, my name is Katrine Danielsen. I'm a gender advisor at the Royal Tropical Institute in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, and I'm a member of Women's Rights and Mining, a collaborative initiative that aims to increase commitment, awareness, and understanding of women's rights in mining. I'm happy today to give you a glimpse into the main findings of a study that Women's Rights and Mining did together with GIZ. You have learned this in this week's lesson, that sexual and gender-based violence is a human rights violation. It's a global concern affecting women, men, girls, and boys across the world. Sexual and gender-based violence can be found within many sectors and value chains. But we have seen more and more research and case examples that highlight specific concerns in the mining sector. And that's what we would like to share with you today. So in response to let's say, this concern in the sector, as I mentioned, a study was done, commissioned by Women's Rights and Mining and GIZ on behalf of the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. And it is a review of evidence around sexual and gender-based violence in the mining sector, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And we focus on 4 countries: Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, South Africa, Tanzania, and Uganda. There were 4 main objectives of the study. First, to explore the intersection between sexual and gender-based violence in the mining sector in sub-Saharan Africa. Secondly, to present evidence on both the forms, the drivers, as well as the prevalence of sexual and gender-based violence related to the mining sector in particular. And then also present and analyze current legislation and policy and practices from different stakeholders in this area and offer recommendations. So today's lecture, we will present some key findings of the study, but we are not able to present everything from the paper. First, we will talk about how sexual and gender-based violence is related to the mining sector. And secondly, we will look into how different women are affected by SGBV in different domains of the sector. And thirdly, we will look at some of the policy and practice responses to this issue in mining sector. So what are the links between sexual and gender-based violence and mining? What we found from our review is that sexual and gender-based violence in the mining context, which is something that will resonate with what you've already learned from the lesson more generally, is that the structural changes that mining brings to an area can lead to increased risks of sexual and gender-based violence. These structural changes brought by mining can, for example, be increased cash flows or labor migration, or they can concern displacement of people, unequal distribution of benefits to individuals or groups who are well off, powerful, and these benefits, such as, for example, very negative impacts on the environment that affect especially those who are not so well off or who are marginalized for other reasons. Literature tells us, however, and this is quite important to take note of, that mining alone does not necessarily cause sexual and gender-based violence. Many communities will have underlying inequalities that predate the arrival of a mining or extractive operation, and in all likelihood pre-existing levels of sexual and gender-based violence. What does happen, in other words, is that mining activities have an exacerbating and amplifying effect on sexual and gender-based violence. Numerous explanations of violence in the mining sector, they emphasize that the masculine nature of the industry as a key factor here. We have to be a bit careful though. Several scholars do actually caution against too simple explanations of men as violent and women as victims, because these explanations are not helpful. They create a binary, a gender binary, as if it's 2 unrelated categories, men and women. And that gives the wrong impression that the mining sector is a male space only, which it isn't. Women in mining are not just merely victims. They occupy a large and diverse variety of roles. And moreover, women are not a homogeneous group, neither in mining nor anywhere else. Other scholars also emphasize that whilst a lot of literature focus on male mine workers committing individual acts of violence, it's important to consider the role of international mining companies, states, and in some cases also paramilitaries or security forces in carrying out violence directly or permitting or perpetrating it. We are going to now look at the evidence of sexual and gender-based violence directed towards women in the sector. I'll do that by focusing and making a distinction between 4 different groups of women in the sector. Women as employees in large-scale mining, LSM, women workers in the artisanal and small-scale mining, so ASM we call that, women as community members in communities affected by mining, and finally also women as advocates and activists. And before we start with this, I'd like to just emphasize that these domains are not mutually exclusive. Obviously, a woman can belong to more than one of these at the same time. And again, that women's experiences within these domains they're not homogeneous. There are other factors and positions, age, income, disability, sexuality, that intersect with gender to shape women's experience. But let's first look at large-scale mining employees. For these women, sexual harassment is the most commonly evidenced form of violence that we found in our review, ranging from psychological violence in the form of verbal abuse to extreme acts of violence, such as cases of rape and murder of women working in mines in South Africa, for example. Also, there's much evidence of women having to provide sexual services to men in return for assistance in large-scale mining. As artisanal and small-scale mining workers, women, on the other hand, experience considerable socio-cultural violence, such as social exclusion and discrimination. Restrictive social and cultural norms and beliefs on the one hand, and on the other hand, gendered constraints to accessing and controlling resources, they concentrate women in lower paid and often much more hazardous tasks in the sector. And in this context, it appears that sexual and gender-based violence, it further consolidates and maintains women's precarious conditions in ASM. In addition, as much of the evidence around sexual and gender-based violence in the artisanal and small-scale mining sector comes from the Eastern DRC. Literature tells us how mining and sexual violence have long been a feature of armed conflict, and horrific acts of physical and sexual violence of women in mining areas have been found to be commonplace. The role of sex work in and around the ASM sites is also widely discussed, but it's also contested. Much of what's described in the literature seems to be exploitative. However, this is not always the case. Sex can be used as a livelihood coping strategy by women, as research from Uganda, among other countries, show us. We also have to be mindful that when the presence of sex workers around mining sites is generally presented as a negative impact of the sector, this will or can erase the agency and experiences of women who choose to participate in sex work. Let's look at women in mining affected community as a third group. Multiple studies highlight the structural changes that the introduction of mining can bring. One illustrative example is the shift from subsistence to cash economies, which seems to lead to tension within families around how money is managed, which can lead to increased sexual and gender-based violence. Beyond increased concerns of domestic violence, the issue of sexual and gender-based violence perpetrated by mine security forces is also reported as a specific issue that's described by UNDP as an endemic problem. Reports in Uganda and Tanzania note cases of rape by mine company workers and security guards, and reports show that police involved in guarding mines often have been complicit in these acts. Finally, women can also interact with the sector as advocates and activists. Conflicts between mining companies and communities can escalate and may include sexual abuse or rape. Human rights defenders face a multitude of risks, and women human rights defenders can face additional gender-specific risks in challenging mining activity, including sexual harassment and intimidation. What we can conclude from our study is that sexual and gender-based violence is a reality across the 4 domains of women's interaction in the sector, But we can at the same time conclude that there's no one uniform manifestation of sexual and gender-based violence in the mining sector. For women as large-scale mining employees, sexual harassment is the most common form of sexual and gender-based violence, while women ASM workers more often experience more horrific acts of sexual violence. In host communities, women seem to be exposed to violence at the household level through structural changes that take place as mining operations enter their lives, and in the community itself from, for example, security guards. And women activists or advocates seem to be exposed primarily to verbal abuse and harassment as a means of control, but we also see physical attacks on human rights defenders. That's a real risk too. Across the four domains, a commonality appears to be how apparently protective or supportive structures fail or even actively harm women. In South Africa, research highlights resistance of unions in taking up women's complaints, whilst protective laws around pregnant women effectively crowd them out of the sector. For women in mining-affected communities, the very police who they should be able to report acts of violence to are shown to be complicit in those acts. And that same feature is also opposing women's activists from holding mining activity to account. Underpinning all of this is sexual and gender-based violence as an expression of unequal power relations. The inaction of companies and governments is inexcusable, but the norms that permit or enable this violence permeate across the four domains and also across the four focus countries of the study. Earlier, I mentioned that sexual and gender-based violence seems to be used to maintain economic control over resources, often by men or women, but sometimes by states and companies. It looks as if this structural violence at times is used as a means of maintaining patriarchal order, that's ensuring that control of resources remains with men, and ensuring that women behave appropriately according to what's permitted by prevailing norms. Underpinning this are the huge power differences that characterize the mining sector. Whether this is between women in large-scale mining operations and their managers, or it's between women in ASM and gatekeepers of powers, such as, for example, those that give permits to be involved in mining in this part of the sector. Or is it between mining companies and host governments, or between community members and mine operators? In all these relationships, there are frequently vast and often entrenched power differences between the victim survivor of violence and the person or group perpetrating it. We also know from the literature that company security forces, and I've mentioned that already, that they sometimes even use state security, and that they have perpetrated violence against women and men in mining communities with relatively little consequences from host governments. That might be due to power, the power companies can hold over host governments given the revenue produced by mining. It might also have other reasons. Similarly, women working in mining operations are subject to the power of male managers and colleagues, and to that of the company and their production targets, in contexts where they could be dismissed with relatively ease. Until now, there has been no systematic evaluation of the best responses to sexual and gender-based violence in the sector. If we've got that, that would undoubtedly show us that it differs depending on context, and basically that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. However, from our study, we can see that there are some overall general principles of sexual and gender-based violence preventions and response that can be considered in this sector. What our study found is that many existing interventions that aim at addressing sexual and gender-based violence, they focus on primary prevention, that's strategies to reduce the prevalence of violence. And in this context, literature tells us that programs that aim to reduce violence through changes in practices and norms in the public space have demonstrated reductions in physical as well as sexual partner abuse. There's also some evidence that sexual and gender-based violence interventions that address restrictive gender norms and local notions of masculinity, that they are more effective at reducing violence than those that do not address these norms and notions. Indeed, our study found that effective sexual and gender-based violence programming must be informed by context-specific research and local experiences and local expertise, so that responses are tailored. Literature, however, also tells us that there are risks associated with programming in this field. For example, awareness raising or work on social norm change can in fact push survivors into under-resourced services, or they can result in backlash as they expose them to stigma and discrimination from family and community members. There is some literature on the role of companies in challenging norms that enable or perpetuate violence. The study found that the extent to which individual companies will or can be expected to engage in processes of normative change is likely to be limited. However, what companies can do is that they can set clear expectations and codes of conduct around behavior, whilst broader normative change is an important area for government as well as civil society attention. In conclusion, our study found evidence of verbal and sexual harassment, sexual violence, physical violence, and socioeconomic violence within the mining sector, with violence sometimes operationalized to concentrate control of resources and higher valued roles with men. We also found that whilst forms and prevalence will differ across contexts, sexual and gender-based violence appears to be a pervasive issue across all women's domains of interaction with the sector, often sanctioned or perpetuated by those in positions of power. Indeed, unequal gender relations seem to be at the root of much of this violence. However, whilst forms of sexual and gender-based violence may precede the arrival of mining operations, this does not in any way justify companies failing to combat sexual and gender-based violence in the workplace and safeguard their employees, nor does it excuse governments failing to provide meaningful channels for redress and survivor-centric service provisions, context-specifically developed. And at the same time, while mining sector stakeholders clearly need to do more to tackle sexual and gender-based violence, this should be through collaboration with existing sexual and gender-based violence actors, drawing on existing professional standards and guidance on prevention and response. Our study also stresses that women are not purely victims of the mining sector, nor are they a homogeneous group in their experience. Many women choose to work in the sector or in roles around it. Sexual and gender-based violence is a form of structural violence that makes some women unable to do so safely and free from violence. Some researchers caution women and steer analysis in the mining sector. Others stress how important it is that we move beyond stereotypical portrayals of women as a homogeneous group of passive victims of mining. And others again emphasize the need to consider sex workers in the mining sector in their own right, not just as victims or negative outcomes of the sector. It's crucial to recognize that whilst there are risks of sexual and gender-based violence in the mining sector, these risks should not be construed as a reason to prevent women from accessing opportunities in or around mining operations. These arguments, more than anything, highlight the need to consider women as active individuals with their own aspirations and agendas across their roles in the mining sector. Finally, for those of you who want to know more about the ins and outs of sexual and gender-based violence in mining, I do recommend that you read the full study, which can be accessed at the Women's Rights and Mining website. The report also offers an overview of legal frameworks in sub-Saharan Africa that address sexual and gender-based violence in the sector, as well as a detailed list of recommendations with regard to action needed for different women across the 4 domains and for different stakeholders. Thank you for listening.